Good morning. Welcome to Casual Conversations. Thank you for joining us today. This is Pastor Scott. I'm your host today, and joining with me today on Casual Conversations is Reverend John Whitsett. Good morning, John.
Hi, Scott. Good to see you again.
You too. Thanks for coming back on, joining us from Houston. Everything
Glad
going well down there?
it's hot. It's the beginning of summer down here, but I'm staying inside and the air conditioning's working, so all is well. Yes.
Well, I appreciate the partnership and the encouragement and support, John, that you have given me across the years when we were pastoring on the same district also, since I started Momentum Ministries and doing the work. You contributed a lot of articles to the climb, and I appreciated that. I think the most articles was me. The better have been, right? My name was on the cover.
Yeah.
Your name was on the cover of one of the books,
I was
though.
on the cover of one. You graciously put me on there so I could have a bullet point on my resume
Yeah.
that name on the cover of a book somewhere.
Well, the fact of the matter is, my daughter is, if anybody's familiar with The Climb and reads it, my daughter Jenny is the co-author on three of the books because
Yes.
she contributes more of the articles than anybody else besides myself. But the one that you're the co-author on, you had taken up the slack from what Jenny wasn't able to do that year. So, but you've
Glad,
contributed to more than just one book, too.
glad to be somebody not from the bloodline that could actually
Yeah, yeah. So I don't know whether you want that advertised or not, but it's out there now. So, well, John, you also have your own ministry. You retired after pastoring for how many years?
I about 35, about
35
35.
years of pastoring, and you've been retired now for how long?
Was summer of 2019, so almost five. Hard to believe.
Wow.
I
Yeah.
stepped away from full-time ministry. I didn't step away from ministry, but stepped away from captaining the ship.
So
For the
you have been preaching
Mhm.
and supplying and taking care of some family situations too. I understand from our conversation before
Yeah,
we began. But one of the things you did, and I think the story is that your kids really encouraged you to start a blog.
they did. Um, and I had no idea how to do it. I couldn't have been more clueless, but they started me doing it, and it's become something I don't there's no real rhythm to it, but it's just become a good outlet for allowing me to process thoughts that when just because you're not preaching every week doesn't mean you're not thinking about things and not processing. And it's become a good outlet for that.
So I think that Kingdom Thoughts and Reflections, right?
I believe that's the name I
That's
put.
yeah. How do people find it?
I really don't know because I um
Ask my kids, huh?
ask my kids or send me an email and I can add them to the subscription.
Okay,
Um,
well, I know I get it every time that you publish something new, and I look forward to it. Excellent material. I
oh,
have my own way of communicating, my own style of preaching and writing, which is different from yours. And
mhm.
I like to think you're more of a scholar. I mean, you really can pack a lot of meaning into the biblical story that you're relating to, and I appreciate that so
I've,
much.
I've been told you ought to be a teacher, which I don't know if that means that your preaching is less than desirable and want to put you in the classroom. But yeah, I do try to preach in such a way to where people can understand some of the background and of the passage, and hopefully it can help it come alive for them.
Well, tell you what I'll do. I'll put the blog address in the description of this podcast so folks can look
Well,
that up and
my
subscribe.
name's
I recommend it.
johnwhitsett.com. So
JohnWhitsett.com. So get on there. All right. Well, John, recently, I think it was back in May, you put one out on your blog that I just was fascinated by, the opening story especially, but
yeah,
it was about the Great Banquet in Matthew.
chapter 14, right?
Okay, Matthew chapter 14.
Oh, Luke 14, actually.
Okay. Um, So when I read that, it wasn't too long, maybe right in that same sitting. I just said, I texted you or emailed you. I can't remember which. Said, John, you got to share this on my podcast. And so you agreed to do that. And I'm going to ask you to kind of just today, just take over the reins of casual conversations. This conversation is going to be more a presentation. I want you to just share this message. I think it's a very helpful message and one that my listeners, our listeners, will benefit
What
from.
got me going was a few months back, I read articles, actually a couple of articles. I found them online about a couple of brides who were stiffed at the last minute by their fiancés, and they couldn't get their money back. The family couldn't get their money back on their reception arrangements. And so what they did is they contacted area ministries that serve the homeless and said, would you like to create an evening to remember for your clientele? And of course they said yes. And that whole thing reminded me of the story Jesus told in Luke chapter 14. We were involved in this painted where we're looking through the parables. And so I asked, would it be okay if I preached on this one when it was my Sunday to preach, and my lead pastor said yes. And so I spent some time looking into that story, and it's a fascinating story. It's interesting that Jesus tells a story about what goes on at a banquet while he was actually at a banquet. If you go back to Luke, the first few verses of Luke 14, Jesus is at a dinner party when he shares the story, and it tells us that the dinner party wasn't so he could be honored, so he could be recognized. The dinner party, he was invited so that those in charge could keep an eye on him. They were hoping that he would do something or say something that they could use against him. And if you read through Luke 14, it begins with him healing a guy who had a disease called dropsy, which is kind of a swelling of the joints that was very, very painful. It was on the Sabbath, which obviously set up some controversy with the Jews that were there. Jesus then tells a story about how it's best for us to assume a low profile seat and be asked to move up than to jockey for position. A lot of those dinner parties, those in attendance would jockey for position to be recognized, to be at the seat of honor. Now, it's better to assume a low profile position and move up than to try to assume a high profile position and have the host come to us later and say, I want you to relocate to this less prominent place. So that kind of sets the story up. And then a toast was offered to Jesus, and Jesus, rather than responding in the traditional expected way, says, hey guys, let me share a story with you. And the story he shares is a story that of this host who throws open a banquet, asks a variety of people to come, and then they just say they're not going to come. And so he says, I want my table full. And so I want the lame, the crippled, the blind, the infirm, people who aren't normally invited. I want them to be invited to this banquet. And it helped me understand a little more what was going on when I realized the way that, banquets worked back in the ancient world. A big event like a dinner party was a huge logistical challenge. They didn't have electricity. They didn't have refrigeration. They didn't have a lot of the conveniences we have today. And so the way it worked is that the host would issue a blanket invitation to people that he wanted to come, and they would say yes or no. And then later, after all the preparation was complete, after all the animals had been slaughtered and the food had been prepared and the bread baked and everything else, a messenger would be dispatched a second time and would say, hey, it's time. The banquet's ready. Come now. And it was expected that you would drop what you were doing so you could come to that banquet. But in Jesus' story, when the messenger was dispatched the second time, a number of those had concocted excuses as to why they couldn't come. One said, I've got to inspect this land I just bought. Another one said, I just purchased a team of oxen, and I need to go try them out. The other one said, I just got married. And all of those, when you understand a little bit about the way that world worked back then, all of those were pretty flimsy, lame excuses that were kind of the, hey, I just had something that I want to do that's more important than you come up. And so that's why the host in Jesus' story sat there and said, okay, let's go out into the highways and the byways and pull in the people that I want my table full. Let's pull in people that wouldn't normally be included in this kind of thing. I mean, there's obvious symbolism in the story that's easy to pick up on. The Jews, they were the original invitees to the banquet. Um, the host is God. The Jews, if you recall, God established a covenant with the Jews. They were a group of people that loosely affiliated family back in the days of the Old Testament, and God reached out to Abraham and then through to Moses and said, you know what? If you'll be my people, I'll be your God. And the Jews sat there and said, yes, we'll do that. We'll abide by that. But if you read through the history of the Old Testament, you know that they really didn't follow through as fully and completely as they led God to believe they would. The thing they did do, though, however, is they developed feelings of superiority, feelings like, hey, we're God's chosen people. We're special to him just because. And so there was this presumptive arrogance that characterized many of the Jews in the time that Jesus arrived on the scene. Now, when you look at this story and think about this story, it's easy, if we're not careful, to misunderstand what Jesus is saying. It can almost sound like, hey, because the Jews rejected me, that going to the Gentiles, that's a reluctant plan B on God's part, that God didn't want to do that, but because the Jews rejected him, he opted to do that because he wants his table full. And that's not the understanding. That's not what Jesus is trying to convey here. Yes, God did start his revelation to the human race with the Jewish people, but his plan the entire time was that the world would be impacted by the Jewish people, that they would serve as a beacon, that they would serve as a lamp, that they would, by the distinctive, winsome way in which they lived, that people would come to embrace and understand and relate to God. But the Jews didn't do that. They didn't live that distinctive life. Why did Jesus share this story? Couple things. Number one, and Jesus always, it's amazing how much he does this. Number one, I think he was trying to call out the spiritual presumption of those that were part of the religious establishment. Many of those in that room call out their arrogance and say, you're not special just because you're a Jew. Yes, you're part of God's chosen people, but that doesn't give you any enhanced standing with God. He was trying to call that out. But secondly, I think he was also trying to provide a rationale for why he spent time with so many of the people that he did, with the people that were ostracized, the people that were shunned from society, the lepers, the blind, the crippled, the lame, the ones who were kind of marginalized. Jesus spent a lot of time with those folks, and he's trying to explain, as he says in another passage in the New Testament, it's not the healthy people that need the doctor, it's the sick. That's why I spend time with the people I spend time with. But as I was thinking about this and thinking about us, particularly people like me, I grew up in the church. I've been a part of the church my entire life. Sometimes I think if we're not careful, we can forget where we came from. And it's very easy for us to become presumptive, very easy for us to be so self-assured that it's almost as if we believe we're worthy just because, we grew up in the church, or we had a Christian heritage, or this or that or the other. It's a reminder that, when it comes to being a part of the family of God, it's not about what we bring to the table. It's about his grace, and that none of us is worthy of that. Yes, grace is free to us, but it was costly to him. And we need to remember that the banquet isn't prepared for those of us that think we're worthy. That the banquet is it's prepared for those of us who know we're not. And that when it comes to how life in God's kingdom operates, that humility, remembering who we are, remembering where we came from, humility is a foundational kingdom virtue. And that's something that so often I think gets lost in our day, is the need for us to be humble, meek servants of Jesus, to not be impressed with ourselves, but to relate and live and interact with others out of a humble spirit. And so that's something that I think God is continually impressing upon my life, and continually, I think, asking the church, particularly in North America, to be that in this day, to be humble spirited people who live that in such a way to where the world can see something in us that is winsome and attractive and compelling, and may open them up to the reality of God. That's my prayer for myself. That's my prayer for the church. In fact, let me pray it for us right now. Father, I just ask that you would continually embed upon us the humility that is to be foundational in terms of how we live for you, that we never get so impressed with ourselves or so presumptive about ourselves or so certain of ourselves that we relate to those around us in an arrogant, prideful fashion, but we would always live out the humility that your Son demonstrated and lived out when he walked amongst us. So, Father, thank you for your work in us. I pray that you'd continue to do it in such a way to where you'd be glorified in us, and that, Father, the way we live would draw others to you, and that people might see you in us because of how we carry and conduct ourselves on a day-by-day basis. I pray this, I ask this in Jesus' name. It's for his sake. Amen. Amen.
Amazing. The banquet is not prepared for those who are worthy, but prepared for those who know they're not worthy. I appreciate that thought. Thank you for reminding me about that today, and our listeners. And thanks for being our guest on Casual Conversation. Come back sometime, okay?
Thank you for the invitation. It's good to spend time with you and to share. I really enjoy it.
Thanks. And thank you to our listeners for making Casual Conversations a part of your day. God bless you. Have a great day.